Today we're going to be speaking with Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is an historian, New York University professor, an expert, and political commentator on fascism, authoritarian leaders, and propaganda. It feels like the right time to have this conversation, Ruth.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So to start with, can you talk? I want to kind of go in order if it's possible. The first where I would like to start is what are the sort of conditions in a society that are the ripest for a strongman type to grasp control?
So it was really eye-opening to me. The book, it goes over 100 years, and so I was looking for patterns and conditions that recur. And one of them, and this will fit America too, in 2016, these kinds of like strongmen appeal when there's been a period of great progress, social progress. It could be gender emancipation, racial equity, workers' rights. And this destabilizes many people and makes them angry. And so these strongmen come up kind of saying, I'm going to turn the clock back. The other condition is polarization. And these leaders do everything they can to exacerbate that polarization because they need us to be at each other's throats. And that helps people to be dependent on them, and it helps them to build their cults of personality.
And so, in a sense, these are often reactive movements to prior changes or movements that gain steam in society.
They are reactive, but Mussolini said it best. He was a journalist. He was full of like good quips. He said it was a revolution of reaction because they also are very charismatic, many of them, and they're able to excite people with the idea that they're promising something new. So Trump was very smart to make it wasn't it was of course with the GOP, but it was a movement. And he had the red caps, like people want to be part of a tribe. And so it seemed very exciting to people. And this has been true of most of these leaders as well.
One of the things that's been interesting to me to see about the movement, I guess, that we're now calling Trumpism is I did not identify anything novel that Donald Trump was sort of pushing on the Republican Party, but he was able to sort of just package the idea of his candidacy as the perfect place to kind of coalesce ideas that had been festering in the Republican Party for a long time. Do you agree with that? And is that common or not?
You stated perfectly what the process is. Every time these men come up, and many of them have they're very savvy about media and marketing. Mussolini was a journalist. Mobutu was a journalist. Hitler took voice lessons, acting lessons, hypnotism lessons when he was trying to get to power. So they come up and they're able to coalesce and channel existing extremist, anti-democratic, and other tendencies in society. And then they form this cult of personality around themselves, and they give it form and they give it focus. And that's where the movement comes in. And then once they get to power, they legitimize all of these things and make them into state policy.
I want to zoom out a little bit for Trump, but because we're talking about some of these aspects, maybe we'll stick with it for a moment. One of the so I've said Donald Trump did not create racism or xenophobia, but he certainly was able to sort of coalesce it and make a large group of people who had those ideas feel like they had a home, maybe be a little more comfortable publicly espousing some of these views. Similarly, it seems as though Donald Trump has also exposed some of the underlying authoritarian tendencies of the American right, although they claim to be very much about small government and sort of the libertarian-esque ideals. They were very quick to sort of look the other way to Trump's authoritarian desires because they sort of were the type of authoritarianism that worked for them. Is that an accurate assessment in your mind?
Absolutely. And I think one of the strengths that I've had to approach this is I'm not a specialist in American history. I'm a specialist in global history and propaganda. And so I came to started writing about Donald Trump and the GOP in 2015, 2016. So I trained this kind of global historical lens on our country. It's been very revealing. So one of the things I learned doing research for the book is that the GOP was actually already moving in this authoritarian direction. So they had already largely given up the idea of bipartisan governance and the idea of mutual toleration, where, you have, excuse me, you have an opponent and you maybe differ, you don't agree with them, but you don't ask for them to be jailed or locked up. So Donald Trump took advantage of this. And since 2016, there have been some comparative politics studies coming out, and they're really eye-opening, that they place the GOP in the context of like world political parties. The GOP actually lines up for its rhetoric and its platforms with far-right parties, like Modi's party in India and Erdogan in Turkey. It doesn't line up with traditional conservative parties. So Donald Trump was a perfect match for this party, and it's like he completed its transformation because he's such an extreme individual.
Is it surprising to you in a historical context how quickly the early opposition from within the Republican Party fell apart, in the sense that if you think back, Ted Cruz was attacking Donald Trump during the primary, Marco Rubio, Rand Paul, Fox News was not with Donald Trump, but very quickly, with very few exceptions, Mitt Romney, John McCain, etc., they all fell in line. Is that common historically?
It's so sad. I felt so sad for America writing this and thinking about this, because these extremists depend on political elites to bring them in the system. And this is what the GOP did. People like Jeff Sessions, who in February 2016 introduced Trump to a rally, and Trump actually said, "Oh, I'm becoming mainstream." And I thought, oh my God, here it goes, right? The sad thing, and this applies to Fox News as well as others, is once these kinds of authoritarian-minded rulers, everybody has to be used and discarded. So look what he's done with Fox News, which is really like a co-producer of his presidency. And there are elements in Fox News that are still defending his attempt to nullify the election results.
Yeah.
But they've turned against Fox News. And this is typical, that these early enablers often get thrown away and they're used and discarded like everybody else who comes into his orbit.
Can you talk, so now zooming out a little bit, can you talk a little bit about the typical playbook and the process through which these strongmen have historically come to power? You've talked a little bit about the circumstances that are ripe for such a coming to power, but what is the process, generally speaking?
So there's this playbook, and the core of the book are these chapters on their tools of rule: propaganda, corruption. I added a corruption chapter, the myth of national greatness, and violence. And so once they can come to power in different ways. And so going over 100 years is really interesting, because you had fascist takeovers, you had military coups, and now you have this period where they come to power via elections. And then they manipulate elections to stay in power. So this is what Donald Trump has been trying to do. And it's very sad that over the time I wrote the book, several of these strongmen have consolidated their power. So Putin amended the Russian constitution so he can stay there till 2036. And Orban in Hungary rules by decree. And these are the people Trump admires. So this was his playbook from the start.
And when you look at when the playbook stops working, or let me rephrase, what can change in a society such that the society starts more strongly rejecting the strongman that at some point they were more welcoming of?
So historically, it's difficult to get rid of them. And in real fascist one-party states, it took, in both Italy and Germany, it took them getting bombed by the Allies to start kind of fragmenting the personality cult. So you need some kind of large disaster, like a national health crisis. It's very sad, but not surprising to me, that Donald Trump received more votes in 2016 than in 2020 than 2016, despite criminal mismanagement of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And once they get their hold and they consolidate their personality cult, it's very difficult for people to peel away from it. And his achievement is all the more, it's all the more of a success, because he didn't have total control of the media, and he didn't even have, he didn't own own TV networks like Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. So I would never underestimate Trump. He's had an enormous success with what he's done.
Can you talk a little bit about the role that masculinity and ideas of masculinity, hypermasculinity, will sometimes play for these strong men? And specifically, I mean, one of the interesting things about Trump is, in many ways, he really is not the image of masculinity. I mean, everything from he figured out a doctor's note to not go to Vietnam. And he's often, the way, if it's raining or too hot, he regularly complains and cuts short his rallies. And yet, the narrative is still one of Trump as the hyper masculine guy. You have Trump supporters who, over the last day or two, have been having a field day on Twitter because this musical artist Harry Styles wore a dress, which they find to be the opposite of masculinity. But yet they're supporting a guy who's not really actually the image of masculinity. So to what degree does it matter? And how can someone who isn't even that actually claim to be it so successfully?
This is the personality cult. Once they bond to him and they believe in him, he's like Teflon, a Teflon figure. Nothing sticks to him. But this was one of the surprising things in doing the research about the book, because the masculinity of the strongman is actually quite complex. On the one hand, they pose as the alpha males, and it's more understandable those who came to power through military coup, or both Hitler and Mussolini had served in the military. Bolsonaro was in the military, and he harks back to military dictatorship. Trump's a little different. And so his success is all the more astonishing because he, as you said, he never fought in the military. In fact, he's been very scornful in many ways of the military. But he still has this alpha male, and he knows how to play on that very well. But the other half of the strongman masculinity is that, as you've noticed, they're always whining. They're always the victim. And this is really in contrast to traditional notions of virility where you're strong and silent, right? This is somebody who can't be quiet via Twitter, again, whining. And this, however, works to their advantage because it makes people feel protective of him. So I've got a lot of quotes of people who say, I'd walk through a sea of COVID to save Donald Trump because he's endangered. And this is why all of them have these victim complexes and victim cults. And so even though Trump is leaving office, his victimhood cult will be more active than ever.
Yes, and that will be something we will have to sort of figure out how to contend with. The book is Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, and we've been speaking with the book's author, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth, congratulations on the book, and I so appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me on.